Okay, at this point I want to go over how the life cycle, the alternation of generations life cycle with the seed plants is different than the seedless plants. The seedless plants have sporophytes. Sporophytes have organs called sporangia. Sporangia contain cells called sporocytes. Sporocytes go through meiosis to make spores. That part is the same for the seed plants. However, the spores in a seedless plant are released from the sporangium, and each spore goes somewhere else to grow into a gametophyte. In the seed plants, that doesn't happen. In the seed plants, the spore never leaves the sporangium and grows inside the sporangium into a gametophyte. So the spores in seed plants, the spores are not released. They're not dispersed. Now the gametophyte of a seed plant is quite small, just between roughly 4 to 10 cells total for the whole gametophyte. We still refer to it as a plant, but it's really just a small group of cells. And it's never going to be separate or independent from the sporophyte plant. It's always going to be inside of the sporophyte plant. So there's two types of gametophytes that seed plants make. So this is not unusual. This is similar to the seedless plants. There are male gametophytes, there are female gametophytes. In the seed plants, male gametophytes are contained in the pollen grains. And the pollen grains contain the sperm. So you can think of the pollen. It's perfectly fine to think of the pollen as the male gametophyte. Sometimes we say it contains the male gametophyte. Now, pollen grains are moved by wind or some kind of pollinator, the birds and the bees. So there's not dependence on water for the sperm to move. And interestingly, the sperm in the seed plants, the sperm are not flagellated. They do not have flagella. So even if there was water, they can't swim, which is kind of interesting. So sperm have to crawl. Now the female gametophytes develop within a structure called the ovule. The ovule, if it's a gymnosperm, we'll use the pine tree as our main example. If it's a cone plant, then the ovule is sort of down inside the cone. And there's more than one ovule in a cone. If we're talking about a flowering plant, then the ovule is within the flower structure. So we'll look at that more closely in a bit. But this structure called the ovule is important. The egg is inside the ovule because you'll remember that the gametophyte, there will be a cell that goes through a special division to form the egg, so that eventually the egg is inside the ovule. And the egg will be fertilized by the sperm. We'll get to how that happens. And when that happens, you have a zygote. And the ovule that surrounds the zygote becomes the seed. So the entire ovule is the seed. All right. In gymnosperms, which are called the naked seed plants, that's it. The seeds are just sitting kind of in the cone. And if the cone falls off the tree, sometimes the seeds just get knocked off. Or an animal can get, a squirrel can get their hand down in there and grab the seeds. So the seeds are just kind of sitting on the cone. Usually when you find a cone, if it's all the way open, you won't find any seeds left. But sometimes you can find a cone that hasn't all the way opened yet, and part of it you can find some seeds still there. So we'll talk about that a bit. But for the flowering plants, the ovule is enclosed in another larger compartment called the ovary. And the ovary, if the ovule becomes the seed, and the ovary becomes what we call the fruit. So the ovary is the compartment that surrounds the ovules, and so the fruit is the thing that surrounds the seeds, because ovules become seeds and ovaries become fruits. So we're going to start, that's a very general overview. We're going to start and just look a little bit at the phyla of the seed plants. There are 4 phyla that are gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have what we call naked seeds. Now again, just because we call them naked, they're still seeds, so they still have the embryo, the endosperm, which is the food tissue, and then the seed coat. But the reason they're naked is they don't have any fruit on top of that seed or surrounding that seed. So we'll use the conifer Phyla. Oh, that was weird. We'll use the conifer Phyla as our main example. It is definitely the biggest group in the gymnosperms. And we'll look just briefly at some of these other phyla, but you don't need to memorize the other phyla names, but you should know conifer Phyla or conifers. You remember that phyte means plants. So these are the cone plants. And then cycads, the gametophytes, and the ginkgos, those we'll just kind of briefly look at. So conifers are important for us in terms of a good example of what gymnosperms are like. And then Anthophyta is the only phylum for the angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that have seeds that are surrounded by some kind of fruit. Fruit is not always something you want to eat. So we're going to look at it from a scientific definition of fruit, not the definition you would see in the grocery store. All right, so what are the conifers? It turns out they are the most diverse and common phylum of gymnosperms. So there's like 700 species of conifers. That's actually not very many, 700 species. You might remember that there were 24,000 species of moss and 11,000 species of ferns. And so 700 species of conifers, it's really not very much. So not a lot of diversity. However, there are a lot of organisms. So it's just when you find a forest of conifers, often they will all be the same species. So you can have a lot of individual organisms and not diversity of species in this group. In terms of economic products, we've been emphasizing that, so make sure you highlight this. Economic products, I would say the biggest ones would be timber, so wood, paper, and resin. Resins are all kinds of things, the liquids that they extract from plants that have a lot of uses in business applications, in construction and those types of things. And then I mentioned here Taxol was one of the first anti-cancer drugs. It's not used so much anymore, but it was an extract from a conifer. But I would say timber and paper are probably your number one most important economic products. All right, what are these things called cycads? Cycadophyta and ginkgophyta. Cycads, it's easier to tell that cycads are related to the cone plants because they do have a cone. But they also look a little bit like a fern or a palm, P-A-L-M, tree, but these are cycads. They're related to the conifers, just in a different phylum. These are all related to each other. Ginkgo is interesting because ginkgo has a very distinctive leaf. It has this fan-shaped leaf, and there is something they extract from the seeds of ginkgo that is used. You can buy, it's called ginkgo biloba, and it's really an extract of the seeds of the ginkgo biloba plant that's supposed to help with memory, although it's kind of an herbal supplement. It's not evaluated by the FDA. But I think what's more interesting are these guys, the gametophytes, and specifically this one, ephedra. he grows in this very dry kind of landscape, very desert-like. But there's a legal compound that comes from ephedrine. So when you buy Sudafed, which is a brand name, you're buying the product that they extract it from the ephedra plant and then they chemically alter it a little bit. And that's legal. So it's called pseudoepinephrine, which is Sudafed. So I should have put a picture of that. Sudafed is a legal drug for, cold symptoms. However, I don't know if you've watched the series Breaking Bad, but in the very beginning, something happens which is very, possible. People started realizing that you could take Sudafed and chemically cook it and make methamphetamine. And so people were going around to all of the pharmacies and drugstores and buying all of the Sudafed off the shelves. And then they were going back to their little lab in their garage or in their basement and making methamphetamine, which is illegal. And so the legal compound that comes from ephedra is Sudafed, is pseudoepinephrine, but the illegal compound pseudoepinephrine can be converted into methamphetamine. So it's kind of interesting. Of course, tons of plants have compounds that are, humans decide are either legal or illegal. The plant doesn't know, it's just making these compounds. But the ephedra is kind of an interesting guy there. Okay, so we'll go back to the conifers. We'll use the pine tree as our main example. I'm only going to highlight a few things in the life cycle, specifically the points where it's different from the seedless plants. And what you can see here are the cones. And the cones up top here, this is a female cone. You probably recognize that one. And that's one cone. And then down here on this picture, get my pen. So this is a female cone. This one you probably recognize. Down here is where you see the what we call the bract, which is like one of these little woody pieces. If you pulled it out, you could see deeper down what's going on. So if you go down into the cone, you can kind of find where the ovule is. So this part of the bract is what sticks out. And then you would have to pull it off. You would be able to find the ovule. So each of these bracts has actually two ovules if you were to pull them out. But they're kind of deep down in there. Now the male cone, actually each one of these little things is a male cone. And they usually grow in little bunches. So each one of these is a whole cone. So there's probably 20 cones in this bunch. They're really small, and it's easy to look at the whole bunch and think that the whole bunch makes up one cone. But actually, if you look more closely, each one of these is like a teeny tiny cone. They're more papery, I guess the word would be. Like they're more fragile. They're not as woody as the female cone. And when you shake them, a whole bunch of pollen comes out. So that's one way you can tell. If you shake it, dust, well, it's pollen comes out of it. So anyway, the male cones and the female cones. The male cones are easy to miss because they're small, but they have the pollen. So what happens is the pollen from a male cone will go through the air typically, and some of it will go down into the bract, and it will touch the sort of the outer edge of where the ovule is on the female cone. And the pollen grain then has a little cell that will grow into a little tube, and it will actually digest through this material. And then there's a cell, it's called the generative cell. That generative cell will go through mitosis and make two sperm. And those two sperm will crawl down the tube until they get to the egg. And the egg is inside the ovule. This process takes a long time. We'll see that on the next slide. But once the egg is fertilized inside the ovule, the whole ovule becomes the seed. And then typically the seed will just fall off of the cone, and it's not surrounded by a fruit. So it's called a naked seed. And so the pollen is dispersed by wind mostly. There really aren't like insects that visit cones. And so it's mostly a wind dispersal. Anything that's a wind dispersal is really just playing the odds. Like that plant has to put out a lot of pollen because, you know, evolution is just hoping that some of it happens to hit where there's an egg. So the plant has to really put out a lot of pollen to ensure it's, at least some of the pollen is going to accidentally hit an egg or hit an ovule. And so wind pollination means that plant needs to have a lot of pollen. That's why people have a lot of allergies to pine pollen, because the pine trees will put out a lot of pollen. Now, once the seed forms inside the female cone, seeds are usually dispersed. Those can be dispersed by animals. So there could be an animal that carries it off and buries it like it's going to eat it later. You can eat some of these seeds. Or maybe the pine cone just falls down out of the tree and the seeds just fall out. So dispersal, there is some animal dispersal. You also just have, you know, the pine cone just falling, and the seeds can plant on the floor of the forest. So this life cycle is very slow. It takes about 2 years for the female cone to even be ready for fertilization. And when the pollen grain goes down into where the bract is, or what they call the scales, the same thing, then the pollen grain finds the opening to the ovule, and then it takes like a year before the female gametophyte is even completely ready. The pollen tube has started digesting its way through, and then another year or so before fertilization. So you're talking about, I mean, geez, 5 years. It's ridiculous. Maybe that's why there's only 700 species. This life cycle is so slow. Compared to the flowering plants, this is very slow. This is very slow compared to the seedless plants. So the pine life cycle, the gymnosperm life cycle seems to be very slow, and that may be why why they didn't become very diverse yet, I guess I can say. Now let's talk about the flowering plants. The flowering plants all belong to the same phylum. It's called Anthophita, and similar to the gymnosperms, you have the ovules, which contain the female gametophyte, which eventually contains eggs. And the ovule becomes the seed. And so that's the same. The relationship between the ovule and the seed, that's the same as what we had with the gymnosperms. But for the angiosperms, there's another structure. Surrounding the ovule is something called the carpel. And the carpel surrounds the ovule. So you have the ovule, and let's say you have one ovule, and then the carpel surrounds that. And so eventually the ovule becomes the seed and the carpel becomes the fruit. Okay, so that's important to keep that connection. In the flower, there's an ovule, and that becomes the seed. In the flower, there's a carpel, and that becomes the fruit. So we're going to look at the parts of a flower. The flower is really a part of the sporophyte. The carpel contains the ovules, so the carpel contains the female gametophyte. So in some ways, the carpel is at first the sporangium, but then the spores develop into the gametophyte, and so the carpel is also the gametangium, in a sense. All right. It's the same thing there's a male part of the flower where the pollen grains will form, and that part of the flower serves initially as the sporangium, but then later as the gametangium. So they're not, the gametophyte never leaves the sporophyte. And the gametophyte is so small you hardly even notice. All right, so the gametophytes are there, but they're very tiny. So we're going to look at the parts of a flower. You will need to know the parts of the flower. All the parts of the flower evolved from stems or leaves. And so when you look at a petal, for example, that's really just a special leaf. When you look at some of the other structures, those are just special stems. But they have evolved and adapted to have additional functions for reproduction. The parts of a flower are organized in what we call whorls. So there's 4 whorls in any flower. The outermost whorl, and we're kind of like on this flower here, we kind of start, if you think about the flower when it was in a bud, like here's the stem, and then there's like leaves surrounding the bud, and those leaves then open up like this. So the leaves that surround the bud, and then when they open, they're underneath the flower. Those are called the sepals. The whorl of sepals, so the sepals are the individual leaves underneath the flower. The whole group of sepals is called the calyx. So there's one calyx made up of many sepals. All right, the second whorl, if you go more into the flower, are the petals. So the petals make up the second whorl, and the group of all the petals together makes up what we call the corolla. The corolla is the group of all the petals together, corolla. The third whorl is made up of the stamens. The stamens are the male organs, and the stamens have, you can kind of see it here, have a structure where there is sort of a stem-like portion, that's called the filament, and then the top portion where the pollen grains will form, that's called the anther. So filament, anther, and the whole thing makes up one stamen. All the stamens as a group are referred to as the andrecium. That's the third whorl. And then in the very center of the flower, you have the carpels. There might be one carpel, there might be more than one. Each carpel contains an ovary, and the ovary is the large compartment, and inside the ovary can be one or more ovules. So if you have a plant that has just one if you have a flower that has just one ovary and just one ovule, what you'll end up with is a fruit that has just one seed. So for example, an avocado. That would be the flower of an avocado plant would have one ovary and one ovule. But you can have plants that have one ovary and many ovules. So like an apple has one ovary, so you get one fruit, but then there's more, there's more than one seed inside. So an apple would have more than one ovule inside. There's so many variations, though, on this that I'm not going to try to teach you all the different types of fruits. It starts to get really out of control. In fact, there are, 250,000 different species of flowering plants. By far the most successful of the plant groups right now, anyway. Okay, so this is a flower. I think it's an interesting picture because it's a raspberry flower. You can't really see the sepals underneath the petals. I think that's mainly because of the angle of the camera. But you can certainly see the petals. And then these guys that have this brown top part, those are I'm going to exclude the center, so sort of this section here, those are all of the stamen. So in a group. We call them the andrecium, the male parts. And then this cluster in the middle is a whole bunch of carpels. Lots of carpels. And lots. And each one of them, I think in raspberry each one just has one ovule. But all of these all the carpels contain an ovule, and all those ovules can get fertilized by pollen, by sperm. And the interesting thing is that the flower can be pollinated by its own pollen. So pollination means when the pollen touches the carpel. That's called pollination. Fertilization doesn't happen until a tube cell goes down from the pollen, and then the sperm crawl down that tube cell to where the egg is. So pollination has to come first. But in a raspberry, and there's a lot of little sections, and that's because these are all the little ovaries. Each one of them had a little sticky up section. And that's what you're seeing at the top view here. You're looking at these at the top sections, but those fall away after fertilization, and you end up with this cluster of ovaries, and that's the raspberry. So how is the life cycle different in the angiosperm? The pictures look a lot different. If I were you, I wouldn't get too hung up on the pictures, how different they look than the other life cycles you've seen. There's still going to be spores formed by meiosis. There's still going to be, each spore grows into a gametophyte. The female gametophyte grows inside the ovule. The male gametophyte grows inside the pollen grain. And one of the main differences is when the pollen grain reaches, it can't touch the ovule directly. And so the pollen grain right here, if you look at this section down here, I think this is where things get kind of interesting. The pollen grain touches the top of the carpel, which is called the stigma. And the stigma is just the very top. And then the tube cell from the pollen grain moves down, and then the two sperm crawl down. And each pollen grain can only send a tube cell down towards one ovule. So in other words, if there's, 6 ovules in this picture, then in order for all 6 eggs to get fertilized, you'd have to have 6 pollen grains touch the stigma. And each of them will send down a tube, and the sperm will reach the egg. So let's talk about what happens to the 2 sperm. For the gymnosperms, for the cone plants, one of the sperm will fertilize the egg, the other dies. Sometimes I call it the winners and the losers. That's for the cone plants, the pine tree. For the flowering plants, both of the sperm fertilize something. And fertilization, remember, is a fusion of cells. One sperm fertilizes the egg. One sperm fuses with the egg. Those two fuse and they become the zygote. The other sperm doesn't die. It fuses with 2 other cells in the female gametophyte, and it creates a triploid tissue. So the zygote is diploid. That's what's going to grow into the next plant. The triploid tissue is going to be the endosperm. That's the food source for the embryo. So in the end, the endosperm is going to get used up. But it's kind of interesting that one sperm fuses with 2 other cells and you get this triploid tissue inside the seed. So endosperm is food for the embryo. And all seeds have endosperm. Now the fruit is going to form from this outer compartment called the ovary. And the fruit is not, this is important, the fruit is not food for the embryo. The seed itself contains the food for the embryo. It's called the endosperm. The fruit does not feed the embryo. So why is it there? It's really there for dispersal, because fruit attracts animals, and animals will eat the fruit and swallow the seeds accidentally, and then they'll go somewhere else and defecate and release the seeds, and most seeds can survive. That's weird. Most seeds can survive the digestive system of an animal and then be deposited somewhere else. So that's an important part. That's an important function of the fruit. Okay, so I'm just going to emphasize again a couple things that I mentioned. Pollination is defined as when the pollen touches the female part of the reproductive structure. So pollen is the male part. In the case of the flowering plant, stigma is the female part. So when the pollen touches the stigma, we say that it's pollinated. However, that's not the same as fertilization. You have to have pollination first, but fertilization depends on that pollen tube has to move down and find where the ovules are, and then the sperm has to crawl down that tube and find the egg. So fertilization only occurs when the sperm and the egg fuse, and that creates these diploid zygote. And the other sperm actually gets to fuse with two cells that we call the polar nuclei, which, don't worry about that, we'll just call them two other cells. And that forms triploid tissue called the endosperm. And the endosperm provides nutrients to the embryo. That's its function. It's always its function. All right, so the advantage of seeds, and this is true in the gymnosperms as well, because they also have seeds. The development of the embryo stops. It goes kind of dormant after what we call the meristems and the cotyledons differentiate. Meristems are the tips of the roots and the tips of the new shoots, stems. So meristem would be, you have in an embryo, you have the part that is going to grow upwards. The cotyledons are the first leaves, and then you have the part that's going to go down. So this part is going to eventually continue to grow into the stem, into the shoot. And this part going down eventually is going to be the root. So those two regions are called the meristems. And then the leaves in the seed, you'll see when we sprout some seeds, you'll see those seed leaves. So the cotyledons are called the seed leaves. They're the first little leaves that come out of the seed. They're like little baby leaves. All right. So the little area that's going to be the stem, the little area that's going to be the root, those are called the meristems. And then you have the little seed leaves. Integuments are just tissues or structures that create the seed coat. Integuments are usually covering a surface, and the embryo becomes dormant, and it has the endosperm with it, and it doesn't dry out, or at least not very quickly, and it can remain dormant for years. Okay, I'm going to take a break. So I've given you a lot of information here.